Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start recording the meeting, and we are live streaming. And now I'm going to turn over the meeting to Dr. Tomberlin so he can introduce the presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for getting up bright and early on a Wednesday morning. Welcome to the combined meeting of prep and entry and budget and compensation. So this meeting is a response to a lot of questions that we've gotten over the course of the subcommittee meetings about the question of micro-credentials. This is not necessarily about what are micro-credentials, but the question that's been put to us several times is how would this work? And so we don't have experience in this, so we decided to invite a company that is doing this work across the country to explain how they are implementing micro-credentials for the purposes of licensure and professional learning. So I want to be very clear with everybody. This is to help answer the question of organizationally, how would we do this, and systematically, how would we potentially roll this out? This is not the solution. This is a solution to help you frame this and get an understanding of how this works and how other folks have approached this problem. So our Jason Lang from Bloom Board has been very gracious in donating his time this morning and this afternoon to explaining how his company manages the micro-credential process for other districts and other states across the country. So I hope you find it informative and certainly ask lots of questions. Jason, I will leave it to you to manage how you want to take questions. If you want to do like a section of the presentation, then take questions on that, or if you just want people to kind of throw questions at you when they come. We will help monitor the chat for you and raise questions that may not get captured. But other than that, I will turn it over to you to introduce yourself and launch right in.
Love it. Thank you all for taking time. Thanks, Dr. Tomlin, for the intro. Certainly appreciate all of your sort of thoughtfulness as we get into this work. Let me share my screen. Can you all see my screen right now? Yes. Yes.
We can, yes.
Gotta love when technology works the way it's supposed to. So I figured we would just sort of go through this in a sort of a bit of a couple different pieces and sort of more broadly, and really just sort of talk a little bit about sort of who Bloom Board is, sort of what our work looks like, and sort of where we're working in different places across the country. Really start to get into sort of this idea of like, what is a micro-credential as we sort of define it? What does that mean? What does it look like? And what's the process to really get into sort of to earn one? How do we want to go about that? And then ultimately sort of how are micro-credentials being used really across the entire career continuum, everything down into high school, dual credit, right, sort of options for students, into paraprofessional certifications, all the way up to sort of obviously leadership roles, advanced teacher roles, sorts of things in the same process. And then really getting into this question of sort of what does quality control look like? How do we think about rigor? How do we think about sort of, this idea of using portfolios creates a lot more pain in terms of managing and certifying and sort of assessing all of those portfolios. And so how are states sort of navigating that? What does that look like? As a quick introduction, so I'm Jason Lang. I'm the founder, president for Bloom Board. The really quick sort of background on us and on me. So we've been around for about 12 years. I did a bunch of teacher prep in undergrad and then ended up going in the finance world, which was terrible and one of the most soulless places on earth. And so I was really excited to be able to sort of go back. I did a joint degree at Stanford in the business school and the School of Education, and really spent the entire time there just looking at how to really help impact education for all kids. One of the biggest drivers, one of the biggest levers in that obviously is sort of how are we training and scaling really high quality instruction. And so spent a lot of time really trying to get into what is it going to look like to really build out scalable teacher training systems. In the early days of our work, we have done, we gave millions of dollars of Gates money to teachers and built sort of the first Amazon marketplace of professional development. And the idea was, could we surface really high quality PD? And then we realized that there were a lot of limitations with the existing PD world. And so about 6-7 years ago, started doing a lot of work in this thing called micro-credentialing, which was at the end of the day ultimately just about what does it mean to help move towards an actual portfolio-based experience versus a time-based experience or a multiple choice test. And, not surprisingly, right, time and multiple choice tests are relatively easy to track because we can just assign credit hours, we can just give sort of multiple choice tests and let computers automate them, and portfolios are relatively hard. And so we've spent the better part of the last 7 years where we've done a lot of work in, at the state level, in policy, really working with school districts, working with individual teachers, and up and down the entire perspective, from legislators all the way down to sort of individual classrooms, really understanding what does it take to make this shift away from time, and what will it require to really maintain rigor, maintain quality control, and really build the best, most scalable systems for creating the best teachers and supporting the best teachers. We have been pretty fortunate in this entire journey. So with all the state level work we've done, we have some pretty amazing backing from a bunch of investors like the Gates Foundation, the Dell Foundation, the Emerson Collective, the Steve Jobs Family Office, and they have also helped us really bring in some luminaries over the years. So Joanne Weiss was Arnie Duncan's chief of staff, and so we worked with her a bunch, and she was on our board for a long time, really helping think through some of the state policy world. Tom Vander Ark, who Bill Gates tapped to start the education work at the Gates Foundation, was on our board for a long time, and so we spent a lot of time with him really sort of working through it, sort of thinking about technology and thinking about sort of all things in that world. So we've been very fortunate to have some pretty amazing help along the way because, again, these problems are just too big to be solved by any one org, any one sort of institution in the process. And so I will also try to make this pretty conversational. So I will stop a bunch, probably almost on every slide. And if you have questions, if you sort of want to either put things in the chat, I can sort of walk through that, or if you want to just sort of come off mute and ask your questions whenever I sort of make some space for it, please do so. Again, the goal is to really sort of try to make this as conversational as possible as we're sort of talking through some of these questions. And I know I tried to get a little bit of questions in advance from what you all are sort of thinking about, but certainly if we don't cover something, please ask, and I'm happy to sort of jump in. Any questions on that so far? Okay. So when we think about sort of the landscape right now, in particular around sort of licensure and micro-credentialing, there is really a bunch of stuff happening in a lot of different areas. And so, and they really sort of bucket themselves in a couple of different key pieces. And so the first one is really around just sort of these licensure pathways and different certification pathways. In work in Arkansas, a lot of what we've been doing is actually the state moved away from a credit hour-based licensure system and passed some legislation a couple of years ago that we were sort of helpful in informing. It was really about how do you create a 4-tier licensure system that allows teachers to go from early career educators to teacher leaders to professional educators to teacher leaders to master teachers, and create pathways so that they can almost have an equal system for master teachers and teacher leaders, so we're not forcing teachers out of the classroom by making them go into leadership because that's the only place they can go make more money. And so we spent a lot of time at the state. We've moved and we've sort of built master teacher, lead teacher designations in micro-credential form with them and piloted them and have a lot of perspective on sort of how that played out and what works and what are some of the challenges in the process. And so we've definitely seen some of that sort of core licensure systems, especially for sort of advanced roles, start to play out. In Alabama, they're doing a lot of really interesting work based on the state's strategic plan around some of these high-need licensure pathways. And so they're looking at what would it take to actually build special education licensure or ESL licensure where, we just can't get enough teachers right now in classrooms to get to meet just the special education needs alone. But also we've got a lot of supports for ESL, a lot of supports for Get Them Talented. And so we have to have systems to manage that and build out sort of those structures. And so we've been helping the state to think through that, think through the policy dynamics there. In Texas, there actually is a bill that the House passed, I guess 18 months ago, almost 2 years ago now, called HB 2424, and it's a really simple bill of almost less than a page that just simply allows micro-credentials as an option for all programs of study related to licensure. And so that's been something that we've really been sort of keen in sort of figuring out what does that look like again, mostly applying it to some of these high-need teacher areas, whether it's special ed, whether it's ESL in their case, or early literacy. And so there's also a bunch of different work happening in some of the mentor and master teacher world in that place alone. And then Kentucky's one of the other really sort of big licensure examples where they have a rank change system for teachers to maintain and advance on their licensure. And 2 years ago, they passed some legislation that actually allows for competency-based rank change. And so we've been partnering in their case with the service centers and soon to be some of their IHEs, and we've been partnering to then embed micro-credentials into that rank change structure to support it in sort of a very portfolio-centric way. And now that is expanding into some computer science endorsement sort of work, into some CTE licensure work that we've been working on with them as well. And so that's sort of the core set of this, really sort of licensure-related work that we've been doing a lot of. Not surprisingly, that has also started to branch out into some of the more soft endorsements or add-ons, right? And obviously, all states handle both the language around add-ons and endorsements and sort of the structures relatively differently. And so there is this sort of soft area of licensure that is, are there content-specific endorsements? Are there add-ons to licensure? And why would a teacher go get those, or what's the incentive for them? Typically, it's in some sort of stipend or some sort of district choice. But a lot of them are really sort of now starting to come up in computer science in particular, because computer science, not surprisingly, is a relatively new certification area. And so we've worked with the state of Arizona, where they wrote some legislation around micro-credentials, allowing for sort of advancement licensure. We worked with code.org and the state of Rhode Island to think through sort of what a sort of computer science endorsement looks like. In Rhode Island's case, we actually also have been working with UCLA to build out a set of ESL micro-credentials and embed those into the ESL certification system in Rhode Island. And then we've also done, obviously, a lot of work in South Carolina and now in North Dakota around cybersecurity with cyber.org. And then Oklahoma has some new legislation around sort of computer science and special education sort of endorsements as well. And so ultimately, right, there is a relatively good body of evidence for both the legislative side of competency-based licensure and a lot of the sort of touch points between how do these micro-credentials, how does micro-credential and portfolio-based learning integrate with the existing systems, with professional development, with higher ed institutions? How do you sort of navigate and manage that? And so we'll go through a bunch of that today, but hopefully that gives you sort of a couple examples. The third big example on the licensure side is really around sort of leadership pathways. And so in Louisiana, we've actually have replaced praxis statewide for all teacher leader licensure. And so if you're going to become a mentor teacher, if you're going to become a content leader, which is defined as state in a specific sort of teacher leader role, you no longer take a multiple choice test. You actually have to build a portfolio that shows, for instance, one of the mechanisms around sort of mentoring and sort of building and providing targeted feedback. So as a mentor, you don't take a multiple choice test. You actually have to build a portfolio, and you have to videotape you and a mentee having a conversation about that teacher's personal growth plan and show how you're providing really targeted feedback for that teacher to advance in really important ways in their classroom based on their own personal goals. And so that's the sort of shift that we're seeing, is it's moving away from time, moving away from sort of just multiple choice tests where we just frankly can't get to the level of fidelity of practice that we know we need to help kids, and how do we then build systems to manage and support that, and how do we think about the policy environment around that world. And so in Louisiana, we've also then stacked that teacher leader licensure work into a principal license, and so it's the first competency-based principal license that exists in the country, which has been really interesting to see how that sort of continues to play out. And then in Illinois, we partnered with the state board, we partnered with Illinois State University to actually build a leadership for equity set of micro-credentials that can be a formal endorsement that goes on a principal's license in the state of Illinois. And now we have leadership for SEL and leadership for EL endorsements as well that we're building with the state and allowing them to sort of embed inside of that licensure, inside of that endorsement structure. And then I think that there are a couple folks from Charlotte Mech on the phone. We do have some work in sort of mentor leaders and sort of the advanced teacher roles work that you all have been supporting and funding for the last couple of years around starting to build out mentor pathways, starting to build out sort of ways to think about how do we incentivize teachers into teacher leadership roles? How do we make sure that that's not just a hand-raising process, which it unfortunately has been for decades in many places, where principals are, effectively sort of letting anybody who can raise their hand be a mentor, or nominating people based on sort of their proximity rather than based on sort of clearly defined criteria of what good mentorship and what good teacher leadership should look like. And that's really where that micro-credential can do some heavy lifting in that context. And then the last big area that is a little further flung and a little crazier is really around some of the CTE and workforce development work. So in Indiana, we have a partnership now with the state and with Marian University, where we're building a dual credit high school student teacher intern pathways. And so this idea of, can we take high school students, give them some supports where they can push into elementary school classrooms to help with tutoring and help with COVID recovery and help with sort of math support for elementary kids, and give them dual credit pathways or dual credit options based on those portfolios. And so that's a really interesting body of work as we think about earlier grow your own pipelines for teachers. And then we just launched, actually yesterday, with the Walton Foundation, with the Indiana Department of Ed, we launched a new employability skills sort of partnership around graduate pathways and graduate requirements to think about, well, how do you codify, right? We know that employers are asking for more support for employability skills, more ways to sort of have students demonstrate that. That's not just a checklist from their internship. And so we're working with the state to build a set of employability skills around communication and around collaboration and around work ethic that allow for students to demonstrate those skills in rigorous portfolios and have a really strong assessment mechanism that can help support that in the process. And so lots of interesting work to come there. Again, on the CTE side in Minnesota, we are, the state board and the standards board has approved us as an alternative certification mechanism for career tech ed certification. And so we're working with the state there. And then in Florida, we're doing a lot of work around paraprofessional certification and some other workforce pathways as we get into some of the sort of other side of our world. Let me pause here because I know that this is a lot. Any questions, any things that we want to make sure we cover off and can talk to? Obviously, the teacher pipeline work we will sort of get into here in the next hour and a half or so. But any questions up front before we jump in? I'll give you a little extra time since typing in the chat never is a fast process. Okay. And so that's sort of the background on just sort of the Bloomberg world and on sort of the work we've been doing with states, with standards boards, with licensure sort of teams, and with sort of various sort of legislative stakeholders. Obviously, I think one of the big questions that comes up is sort of this ambiguity around what is a micro-credential, and there's sort of a whole spectrum of the world of micro-credentialing that I think is a little bit confusing. And so I want to make sure we cover off sort of when I use the word micro-credential, what do we mean about that? And what's the process to earn one, and therefore sort of how do we think about grain size? How do we think about, sort of the structures in place that can sort of help teachers through that process? And so in the grand scheme of things, in the micro-credentialing world, there is a pretty big spectrum. And you have at one end of the spectrum, and I often, don't necessarily call that this sort of the micro-credential world, but there is this sort of badging world that lives at one end of the spectrum that is really about sort of more about the digital badge. And so you can go to a conference these days, and if you attend the conference, they will give you a digital badge. Sometimes they call it a micro-credential, like that, but is what it is. But they will give you a digital sticker, a digital badge for having done something. And that's really the sort of the platform and the system that exists. And so in that world, right, there's not sort of the underlying portfolio necessarily. There's not sort of necessarily the rigor all the time, right? It just depends on sort of the badge, and it depends on what it's for. But we know that they're added to lots of different sort of activities that you can do still in a seat time model. At the other end of the spectrum is probably where we live, which is really about how do you think about sort of the rigor of a different sort of learning experience, And how do you sort of navigate that? And so my favorite analogy that we often use is this idea of, take it outside of the education context, so it's a little bit easier to sort of make sure that we're all on the same page. Imagine you were all going camping this weekend, and you wanted to run a session, run a workshop, run some professional learning on how to build a fire as a good survival skill. And you were going to bring me in as your facilitator to guide that conversation. So if we were actually on site, if we were in a school, what we know what this always looks like in terms of the PD context is we would bring everybody down to the cafeteria or the library. Everybody would sit at their tent tops in their, sort of different groups. And if I were the facilitator who was coming in to lead that PD session, I would hand out some reading material, sort of a little syllabus. We'd go through and we'd talk about some of the background about sort of why we need to build fires and sort of what that looks like. I'd probably play a video of somebody building a fire. And then we'd do some breakout groups and we'd talk about, okay, what works, what didn't, when you have to go build your fire, what do you think you'll struggle with? How do you want to sort of, how would you sort of manage that? And then we'd sort of go through that process of what we know normal PD looks like. And then at the end, I would give you an exit ticket or some reflection in the process. And I'd say, all right, hopefully I was inspiring and hopefully you learned something. Good luck when you have to go build your fires this weekend. And that's sort of the normal process that we've had for PD for decades in place. What we know is that the problem there is that there's not a really strong connection to actually taking that knowledge acquisition and applying it to actual practice. And in the teaching context, based on the Joyce and Showers sort of data, there's lots of pretty ironclad research at this point that says only about 5, maybe 10% of the information we convey in PD actually translates into changes in classroom practice. And that's one of the big shortcomings because we spend a lot of money on PD, and if we're going to spend a lot of money, we should make sure that it actually has a real impact in practice in the way we want it to. And so that's sort of the sort of traditional model. Now, in our world, so when we think about using a micro-credential for this sort of process, it gets to be a little bit different. So let's say I was now hosting a separate session. So separate day, same time, and you have these options for learning. In this second session, I'm going to use a micro-credential model to teach you how to build a fire, teach this entire group how to build a fire. And so in that case, we would still bring everybody down to the cafeteria, everybody down to the library, bring people together on Zoom. So we still know that we really vehemently believe that the portfolio-based learning experience has to be a collaborative process. We know there's too much value in collaboration to make it just an entirely online, self-paced, do-it-your-own thing. And so I'll talk a little bit about that from our support structure because it's built into the way we think about the world because the research there is just really good. And so we would still bring everybody together in the cafeteria, the library, if we were in person, and we'd say, I would come in as your facilitator, and I would still give out, have some handouts. I'd still want to make sure that people had background knowledge about how to build a really good fire. So I might play a video in that context, just kick things off to say, okay, here's what really good big fires look like, and we're going to start off by really understanding how airflow works in building fires. And here's why we use teepees or sort of chimney structures to build really good fires because it creates better airflow, and that's sort of how we use that process. And so I would play some of those videos, but then the major difference is about halfway through that session, after we got everybody up to speed on that background knowledge, I would pull out of my bag a bag of tinder and kindling and firewood and matches for every single one of you, and I would say, we're going to go outside right now, at this very moment, we're all going to go build 10 fires together. And while you're building your fires, I'm then going to give you really targeted feedback on what's working and what's not. And that as we're going to go through that sort of process, I'm going to try and give you as much coaching as possible. And that the goal is, once you build a really great fire, I'm going to ask you to videotape it. And I'm going to ask you then to hit submit. And then a third party who is an expert in fire building is going to actually watch your fire, you build that fire on that video. And they're going to then be able to provide really targeted feedback and say, yep, you did a great job building that fire. Nice work. Or here's some ways that you could improve that. What might that look like if you sort of tried this in a different context? And that is the idea behind sort of the micro-credential model versus, the traditional learning PD structure we have today, or the licensure structure that often exists. And that if you had to survive a night in the woods and you were choosing between these two sessions, pretty much everyone chooses the learning by doing. We know this is better. We know it's more, the research here is really good in terms of it's better for adults, it's better for kids, and that the education system more broadly is really trying to take steps to get towards these sorts of models. It just so happens that they're a little harder to navigate. and manage, and that's obviously where technology can come in. But that model, that difference, is really what we then apply to pretty much all walks of teaching. So all of those areas that I showed you on that map, it's really the same idea, where we're taking specific discrete skills, like we'll go through a bunch of examples of what this looks like, and we'll use this example of one really core, teaching competency, which is how do you build really positive relationships with students? And so if we're using that as a discrete skill, right, the question is, I can show you some research around that process, or I can give you asset-based feedback protocols, I can give you lesson plans and templates and tools to really build positive relationships, and then we can go into classrooms and actually have teachers try it out with their kids, bring back those artifacts, give them feedback, and then actually certify their practice on videos and on lesson plans and on student work. And that if we really are trying to think about meaningfully changing practice at scale for all kids, this is a really interesting sort of paradigm shift in terms of that entire process. Let me pause there. Questions about this sort of difference and sort of that analogy in terms of how it relates to teaching and sort of the micro-credential world? And then we'll jump into sort of specifically what does a micro-credential look like and mean in the process. Okay. And so if we think about sort of that world, what we're doing is we're basically taking and we're using this thing called a micro-credential, and at its core, the micro-credential really is the actual sort of definition of the portfolio. And so I know that there's a whole spectrum in here. Again, we talked about there's the digital sticker component of the micro-credential, right, that sort of defines things. Then there's the actual underlying portfolio of the artifacts inside of that micro-credential. And then there's the actual assessment process for it, and then there's the entire learning experience around it. But those are sort of different discrete components that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But the idea is that the micro-credential itself is the defining portfolio of artifacts that define what good classroom practice or good teaching, teacher leadership, or good school leadership, what that should look like in an artifact, in a set of videos, in a set of lesson plans, in a set of student work, in a set of strategic plans if you're sort of working with school leaders. And that set of artifacts then has inside of it an actual rubric that defines the quality of practice. And so we'll talk about sort of alignment to in-task and ways that we're sort of doing this work. But a lot of the work that our content team does is really build out and do the alignment and do the work to say, how do we make sure that we not only are covering off the right competencies inside of a specific set of micro-credentials or sort of skills, and how do we make sure that we're covering off those competencies at a level of rigor and a level of effective practice that is defined by good research. And that's the sort of core fundamental building blocks. And then ultimately, how are we then supporting teachers to build that portfolio? Because what we know is that if you just throw the portfolio or throw the rubric to teachers, that's the equivalent of just throwing a rubric to a set of students, right? You wouldn't do that as an instructor. And so we have to create some scaffolding, some supports to really help teachers go through that process. And so when we think about the learning experience around sort of the micro-credential, it is really this idea that the micro-credential is being defined as the portfolio. And then what we've really started to focus on in the last several years is how do you build a set of support structures around that micro-credential that allow for a bunch of really interesting one-on-one coaching. And so we'll talk about some one-on-one coaching later on about supports and sort of how we are partnering with different districts or service centers or IHEs to sort of embed a more one-on-one coaching-centric structure in and around that portfolio. We know that it also sort of cohorts are really powerful motivators. So teachers want to work together most often. Most teachers, like their peers, want to work with their peers. And so we need to have a way to actually build sort of cohorts into that process so we can help keep people moving and give people sort of that shared destiny and shared responsibility. And so that's really structurally upfront in the micro-credential world that we think about is how do you build that sort of intrinsic sort of set of wraparound supports around that sort of portfolio and around that rubric of what really good competency looks like. And then the way the platform and the way that we think about this is really about a learning by doing experience. So upfront, again, the way the site is actually structured and the way we build the micro-credential process is we're defining the outcomes right up front. Again, start with the end in mind, we're building and defining what are the artifacts that demonstrate really good practice, and how do you think about how those artifacts translate into lessons and units that a teacher might be teaching going ahead. And then are there gaps in background knowledge that we need to make sure that teachers have? So if you're working on good culturally responsive instructional practices, right, there's a bunch of research that Loretta Hammond's done around asset-based feedback and different sort of ways to really frame feedback for students from an asset-based perspective. And that's research that if teachers don't understand, it's going to be harder for them to do and implement that work. And so it's really about building up and using the research that's out there to build those knowledge gaps and really understand what does that look like. Obviously, there's lots of research that exists in the country around different practices, and so this is where we're trying to ground everything we do in not only what the standards are, but what are those background sort of research, the core of the research that really matters most. If you're thinking about early literacy and phonemic awareness, right, and understanding that research, all the way to if you're thinking about, right, that asset-based feedback, thinking about that social emotional side of instruction for cultural responsive instruction. It's really about sort of how do you apply that research and what does that look like when it comes to actual artifacts. Because the next step, so that's where almost, and up to this point here, this is sort of where that traditional PD world sort of lives, which is this is almost sort of learning management, right, sort of style. There's a bunch of sort of modules and widgets and ways to interact with your cohort and your coach in and around that content. The difference is we then immediately ask you to translate that now into going into your classroom, into your school, and building a set of artifacts that are going to demonstrate those practices. And that's really the sort of the core. So we've done a bunch of work around sort of not only surfacing the learning that you need, but now once you apply, how do you apply that learning in your classroom? How do you apply it with your kids? And again, we know vast 80-90% of our team is actually former educators. We know teaching is hard. We know it's more art than science. And so all lessons, all attempts to try something new in classrooms don't go well. And there are some pretty spectacular fails that happen in classrooms every day. And the reality is, right, we need to give space for teachers that even if something doesn't go well, that's why you have your cohort. That's why you have your coach, because you can say, well, I tried this, and man, that did not go as expected. Here's what, how can I do this differently? How can I sort of work through and make sure that I'm really implementing this practice well? And that's where that community of practice, it's where that cohort and where that coaching has to come in as a support structure to really make sure that teachers feel like they have the support system around them to ultimately build that set of artifacts into something where they can say, yep, this is now a portfolio that meets the rubric as defined in that micro-credential. I'm really proud of this. I think this is really great work. I'm going to click the submit button. And then once you submit that portfolio within 5 days, so we review tens of thousands of micro-credentials every year and several thousand in any given month. And within 5 days, we have an entire army of assessors who will then go through, and 2 assessors will actually review that portfolio, and they'll go through and actually, if there's a video involved, there's a lesson plans, they will annotate and timestamp that video and give really targeted feedback and say, here at this minute and this second in your video, here's a little sort of the annotation that pops up that says this is great work, or this is something you could do to sort of help more align you to this part of the rubric inside of that micro-credential as it's defined. And that 5-day turnaround time, we've gone at, early in the early days, there wasn't really a turnaround time. Some folks have it at 2 weeks. We've really tried to push it to 5 days. We're trying to get it down to 3 days, because the timeliness of that review and that result, and the closer you can connect it to actual practice, really matters. Because as you can imagine, if you're a teacher, this process feels more vulnerable anyway. And so if I'm already being asked, right, I'm not just going into a classroom and going into a PD workshop and getting 6 hours of credit because I signed an attendance sheet, or I might be, half-grade papers. Now I'm actually going in and I'm videotaping myself in my classroom, and I'm uploading that video with my lesson plans and my student work. And so there's a lot more vulnerability there, which again is part of why we use that coaching and that cohort model, because we're trying to help diffuse and support teachers through that vulnerability. But then the moment they upload, the moment they hit submit, they are waiting, on pins and needles often for that review, because they want to know how they did. And as you can imagine, right, uploading a set of artifacts of your own instruction as a teacher to the black box of the internet, where an expert is going to rate you on a rubric and potentially tell you news about your instruction that you don't really like or want, that's a really sort of vulnerable process. And so we have to make that, we have to sort of tighten the loop around how fast we can give teachers feedback to as almost on demand as possible. And that's really been our sort of goal, and that's the beauty of technology and the way that we can think about sort of infrastructure is how do we provide really high quality feedback and rigorous sort of assessment while guiding through the process and do it as close to real time as possible. And so I'll talk through that. And it looks like there are actually a couple of questions that are coming up here. So I figured the assessment is always the interesting sort of question here. So there's a question on sort of with respect to assessors, how do you attend matters of environment and context? Do you ensure assessors take into account diverse contexts where teachers are working, such that feedback is unique to that environment and not general feedback that may not account for that context? So it's a great question. So it is a lot of what we're sort of often trying to do, and this is both not only an assessment question, but it's also a micro-credential definition question. So as you can imagine, building positive relationships in a special ed environment looks different than in a general ed sort of environment. And so we have built in sort of ways for teachers or accommodations for teachers in portfolios in the definition of those portfolios to accommodate different sort of contexts, whether it's demographically, whether it's sort of different sort of structures from a student population standpoint, to make sure that we can still provide really targeted feedback, but also to make sure that the definition of the portfolio artifacts is respectful of the fact that those environments often can look different. And that is a design parameter and an assessment parameter. And so that's part of what we do in both cases. I would say the woman who runs our micro-credential design team used to be the head of all academic content. So she was the assistant superintendent for all academic content for the Louisiana Department of Ed under John White. And so she has done about as much work. She's about as good as anyone in the country can get in terms of academic standards and alignments and really thinking through those sort of variations for all students and how do we make sure that we're sort of taking that context into account in that process. As far as reviewers, I'll get into that in a little bit, but the quick answer on who makes up the cadre of reviewers and sort of practitioners. So all of our assessors have to have 5 years of former teaching experience, 2 years of mentoring experience. We have a preference for nationally board certified teachers. And then again, we also take them through a certification process that, not surprisingly, micro-credential them. We take them through a micro-credential certification that makes sure that they can provide really targeted feedback and meet an actual calibrated master scored series. And then because we have 2 assessors for every micro-credential submission, we actually manage them at 80% inter-rate reliability of their assessments on that portfolio. So part of the reason we have done so much work in licensure is because we have really spent a lot of time building infrastructure to manage the sort of complexity and the rigor behind what would it take to really do this at scale across thousands of portfolios a year, and how do we manage that? And so we can get into some, there's also some funny conversations around, we ultimately now, most of the assessment that happens in the system, 99% of it, we manage centrally at the Blue Board side. We do have states that have tried to build out their own assessment armies and have tried to do that. What happens is there's just not enough capacity in the system. And, what inevitably happens is you set a deadline. So we did this in Arkansas when we were doing some induction work initially. And so Arkansas wanted to do their own assessment for their induction teachers. We set up the sort of delivery dates. And not surprisingly, we got about 1,000 submissions at the deadline, sort of 2 days before the deadline. And the department was like, how are we going to review these? How are we actually going to make it through all these portfolios? And so we stepped in and actually built out the army to manage that and support that. Because you're not really just managing the number of educators over the course of a year, you're managing that number of educators times the number of micro-credentials, and you're managing them at the deadline, where 80% of your submissions are actually committed. And so, any questions more broadly there, just about, sort of the process? Again, I'll get into some assessment rigor and some of that calibration a little bit more deeply as we get ahead here when we start talking about sort of how those systems can scale. This question about can you speak to how this process differs from competency-based programs? So again, the competency-based word is a little bit loaded at this point. So it would really depend. The answer to that is really depending on which competency-based programs. Again, the world of competencies, and if you look at the accreditation structures for competency-based programs, right, the sort of the WGUs of the world, right, a lot of that is sort of aligning the initial research and the standards to competencies, but still having more of a reflective process. I think we probably take that a little bit further because when we think about competency, we think about the portfolio of that competency rather than sort of aligning reflection to competency. And so, it would just depend, the ultimate answer depends on sort of what programs you're sort of thinking about. But again, in our world, and when we think about this, it's really about, we're thinking about in the classroom practice as the competency, and then supporting the process for teachers, for educators, for teacher leaders, whoever it is, to go through and build those portfolio, build those artifacts in their actual environment. And that's sort of a very on the job. So we do get questions about, well, if you don't have a classroom, how do you go through that process? We've managed that in a couple of different places, but like we don't have, for the different sort of special ed or different, we don't have teachers who can navigate that without either borrowing or having some access to a classroom, because that classroom practice is the core of the actual sort of competency-based structure, at least in our model. Any other questions about sort of the micro-credential design? And then we can get into sort of how they're being sort of used in different ways. Okay, so the sort of next big question that comes up is really sort of, what does this actually mean? What does this look like? And the reality is there are just a lot of ways that people are using this. And so I think the key takeaway here would be, it really depends on what you want. And then our job from both a platform perspective, but also from a policy perspective, is to align and embed and sort of customize into the systems that you're looking to build. And there are a lot of different ways people are going about this and about using micro-credentials in different contexts. I would say one of the things that we have started thinking, this a little bit sort of has trying to sort of leverage the existing architecture around grain size, is we generally think about micro-credentials not as individual hexagons, as they're sort of laid out here, but we have started to think about them more in sort of aggregate in what is it going to look like to actually sort of build sort of sets of micro-credentials that can scaffold and build progressions to really sort of build on top of each other. So if you think about that, we call these things micro-endorsements. Not surprisingly, they sort of fit into that, the 3-credit structure is a pretty prevailing structure. It allows for sort of portability or embedding, sort of how do you take one away and sort of embed it into a university structure. Like there's lots of ways to engage. Once the grain size of a micro-credential is the same as a Carnegie unit, right, then you can think about the embeddability of that micro-credential as that Carnegie unit in lots of different ways, because it's sort of on the same scale that the existing system and all of the legislation and all of the infrastructure is built. And so we've done that pretty deliberately. So every micro-credential in our world is built to that single credit hour, university credit hour structure, because again, we know that that's how university partners are often sort of looking at it. That's how districts and other folks in PD hours are often sort of managing it. So that is the grain size that we use. And then what we've also started to see is sort of how do you build into specific micro-credentials? How do you sort of build enough sort of breadth that it really allows you to sort of, engage in meaningful practice? Because any single competency at the Carnegie unit, at the single, sort of credit hour level, isn't actually enough demonstration to really try to influence outcomes for kids. And so what we've started to do is, so I use this example of now, let's sort of dig one layer deeper and say, okay, we talked about a single micro-credential, and we talked about building positive relationships with students. And so the way we then built this micro-endorsement, right, it lives inside of this, this micro-endorsement, it's sort of about SEL, right, about really around almost like a precursor to the CASEL competencies. That's really about how do you, address student well-being in classrooms. And we know, given COVID, given all the trauma that's happening at homes and in and around sort of families today, right, there's more need for social emotional sort of supports in classrooms than ever before in history. And so the way we started to think about this from the research side was, okay, well, there is a starting point to that problem. And that starting point is building really positive relationships with kids. And that you need that. And so here are some tools, again, asset-based feedback, learner profiles. How do you show students that you don't think about them just as a random student in your classroom, but you think about them as whole children with career aspirations and dreams and likes and things that they really want to do in their own lives? Because for everybody on the call, probably, right, when you think about the person who was your best teacher, when I think about Ms. Dowdy, who was my high school English teacher, like, she did not think about me as a student, right? She really cared about all the other stuff that mattered in my life, and that's where we know our best educators are able to do amazing work, is they have these really amazingly positive relationships that are grounded in asset-based feedback, in learner profiles, in sort of really strong sort of one-on-one check-ins. Even if they're short, they're sort of grounded in really strong practice. And so that building positive relationships, the portfolio within that is all about how are you building rapport, how are you using learner profiles and asset-based feedback and check-ins to establish that rapport so that now students will actually tell you something. And that's where the second micro builds on top of that initial sort of those positive relationships and says, okay, well now once you have rapport, now you can actually use a universal screener. You can actually assess student well-being by starting to pull some information out of kids and actually ask them what's going on in their lives and where they might be struggling, where they might be having some issues. And that universal screener sort of process, right, is its own set of artifacts in the portfolio. And that now you can use those positive relationships, you can embed that, you can build in, get some of that data from your kids because you have that rapport, you can assess their well-being. And then now from there, the big question is, well, what do you do with that as an educator? And unfortunately, far too many educators feel the burden of having to be the hero. And so they take all that burden on and they feel that they have to be the one to solve that problem. And that is just a recipe for burnout in an already strapped system for talent. And so the way the third micro-credential here is built is to say, well, let's actually try and figure out what's the map of supports that you can use to address student well-being. Now you have the data because you built it and you pulled that data out in your assessing well-being micro-credential. Now let's build a map of supports for you as an educator around what supports are available at the school level, at the district level, at the county level, right, at the community level, so you don't have to take on that burden. And that's its own set of artifacts, its own portfolios to build that map and make those connections so that different data points coming out of your actual universal screeners have direct connections to the supports and resources that you can use to really help sort of support your kids and support your sort of classroom and support their own well-being. And so that idea that these micro-curriculums are really about how does research scaffold in its own right to make sure that we're covering enough breadth but also enough depth to really meaningfully change practice and impact kids' lives, and that allows us to sort of build on top of the work that's already happening. And again, it allows us to then build a broader set of competencies so that we're not just focusing on individual discrete skills, but we can think about these as replacements to existing licensure structures in the way that they're built today. Let me pause here. Questions on this sort of micro-credential grain size, on sort of this, micro endorsement label that we use for this? Questions on sort of grain size around that micro-credential structure? That'd be helpful. Okay. And so from there, so now again, if we think about this is that micro-credential, almost like that cycle of inquiry process we walk through in the building positive relationships. Now what we then can do is, right, sort of take this and make sure that we're aligning to the standards in a really deliberate way. So I won't get into this and you don't have to squint to try to read all this, but underlying every micro-credential in the entire system, in our entire ecosystem, is basically some version of these docs, which is what's the micro endorsement sort of name, what's the structure that we're using to sort of group competencies together, what's the actual, what are the individual micro-credentials that are sort of going into that micro endorsement, and then what are the demonstrated competencies that the portfolio is pulling out, and then how do those competencies align to, in this case, the IMTASK standards across all 10 of those standards, or if there's other sort of ways where we're doing this in special ed, right, we're using CTE standards, right, we're using the sort of the mainstay standards in computer science, we're using the Computer Science Teachers Association standards. So the goal is in our world that not only we're trying to sort of bridge really strong depth and breadth of practice, but how do we make sure that we're covering off the standards in a really discrete way as you're building through any given portfolio. And then again, this starts to allow some really interesting ways to think about the integration points, because obviously, different, PD options, different sort of university options are built on these same standards, and so it allows some much more sort of interoperability there and alignment into the existing structures that exist. And so that's the really key point, is that it allows for a way to stack and a way to integrate the micro-credential, the competency-based structure into the fabric of the work that many of you are already doing it day in and day out. And that's really the goal. We don't want to try and pull people in an entirely new direction. We're just trying to sort of take the work that they're doing in the current direction and apply it in this very portfolio-centric approach that we know which has much more meaningful impact sort of in practice. Questions on that alignment sort of in task sort of structure as we think about that? Okay. And then ultimately what we've then seen, right, is now you can take that sort of, if you have really strong sort of groupings of practice and you have really strong sort of alignment to the standards, well, now you can start to build out some really interesting sort of entire career paths, whether it's new teacher induction sort of supports in classroom management, right, and sort of classroom culture, all the way through. And so you could, think about the world where these are all different micro endorsements that we have that we're sort of working on in different areas. But there are lots of different ways you can sort of build and, sort of align licensure to different areas or different places in this spectrum. So if it's just focusing on the new teacher induction sort of world, where that's more probably going to be classroom management, classroom culture, right? That allows you sort of the progression, and then it might be that student well-being micro-endorsement we got to, right? SEL is a little bit more of an advanced competency, and so, or advanced set of competencies, and so that's going to be a little later in your career as you're going through that. And then ultimately, you're going to get into sort of those master teacher competencies, which might be content specific. So it might be, how are you thinking about sort of math or ELA instruction or ESL instruction or special ed? Because those are sort of the areas where we want to really sort of focus teachers on sort of deepening their craft in a specific content area or a specific area of licensure, because that's ultimately going to keep them both in the classroom but also elevate their practice, as examples for other peers. And that same process works whether it's on the teacher development side or even on the leadership development side. And so a lot of our work in thinking about, well, as you think about teacher leadership or aspiring leaders, it's sort of how do you build sets of competencies that get into, foundational leadership and providing targeted feedback and building shared, rapport with colleagues versus, really core instructional leadership and coaching, cycles of inquiry and sort of coaching sort of protocols versus how do you get into sort of some of the more school-based, parent communication, other sort of leadership skills or leadership for equity or sort of impact and systems change. And so we've sort of really done a lot of work across the entire spectrum. But again, how you define these spectrums, how you define the competencies is in many ways not for us to decide. There's lots of PSOL and lots of in-task research around those competencies, but that's where the standards work, that's where DPI, that's where, sort of the players in the policy game, that's where you all have to and get to define, well, what are the areas that we want to focus on? What matters to us as the state of North Carolina? How do you think about sort of what those areas would be? And then ultimately, I think when we've started to look at it is really starting to think through the entire career continuum. And so in the world that we live in, we have basically partners, whether they're IHE partners, obviously given the dual credit or the parapro certs work, or bachelor, sort of the partners that are building on sort of educator prep work. The question is, how are you sort of embedding and thinking about competencies at every stage of the career continuum? And how do we think about stacking those competencies and aligning them so that we can create a really meaningful opportunity for teachers to make more money and stay in classrooms, because we need them more than ever right now. And we have to create transparency in that process to really help them navigate the career continuum so that they know what their opportunities are to make a living wage, what their opportunities are to sort of move and advance and stay engaged in their craft, in their actual sort of work in their schools. And so you could think about, again, depending on the sort of different state and the different structure or the IHE partner, or the partner they're working with, we have sort of sets of competencies, sets of micros that can be, that align to every single one of these areas in the system. Any questions about sort of the career continuum, sort of again, thinking about where my credentials fit in, whether it's early instruction or later instruction or leadership? Any questions on sort of how my kids will sort of navigate the world that we're living in today? Okay. And so then, with all of that in mind, right? Oh, no question. So I realize this is not a seat time model, can you speak to the expected time frame to accomplish each credential, and how is a timeline established? Yep. So if we go back to the sort of this structure, so for any individual micro-credential, right, this again tends to sort of map to the roughly that sort of grain size of a single university credit hour, right, sort of current unit mechanism. So if that's 15 hours of sort of time, we tend to think about these, the implementation lines, we tend to think about these almost like a 4 to 6 week cycle of inquiry, sort of PLC. So I'll show you in some of the supports pieces that we do, right? We have built some sort of guidance around ways that people can navigate credentials over a 4 to 6 week period with some check-ins and some, in-person, on Zoom facilitation. That's not to say that that's the model that everybody uses, right? Those are some guidance around how you can establish that. But if you think about it as like a 15 credit hour, clock hour sort of structure that then can be embedded into, again, sort of the other sort of systems or the other sort of ways to navigate the system, that's sort of how we do that. So it's almost like a 4 to 6 week, 15 hours of total sort of time of really engaging. Again, when we think about that process from an engagement standpoint, it is really about work that you're already doing on your job and work that you're already doing in your classroom. And so again, we're trying to use teachers' time as best as possible from an overall sort of time standpoint. Does that answer your question? Any other questions there about sort of the time element of demonstration? It always comes up, and obviously again, that 15 hours is very much just a guide, because we know some teachers will move much faster and some teachers will take longer. And really what matters, right, even in the learning activities we have here, these are effectively optional activities, because what matters is the artifacts that you're producing. That's where all of the sort of engagements can happen, because that's really what matters most, is what are we seeing in classrooms and what are those portfolios look like. Okay. Any other questions on my credentials, on sort of the career continuum, any of those different pieces? So the question is, what happens if the micro-credential is not completed in that time frame? What is the guidance for the situation? So we don't really have a turnoff for the micro-credentials, right? You can resubmit, as in our world, you can actually resubmit as many times as you want. We do have sort of an escalation system. So what we find is, teachers will submit. I think right now we average, overall, we have probably about a 62% or so first-time pass rate in the system, depending on the micro-endorsement, obviously, depending on the area. But then, people will resubmit, and so that time frame is, again, very fluid, because it's about, right, well, now take the feedback from your assessor, go back into your classroom, go work on your craft, and then in many states, what we've done is sort of, if you submit 3 times and you're still not earning it, right, that's a problem. So after your second submission, if you don't earn, we then have a escalation process where we have somebody who will then connect with you and one-on-one walk through what's the artifacts, what are you looking for, how do we make sure that your third attempt can be really strong. And then in many cases, we sort of leave it to the partner or the state policy sort of folks to define, well, what's the process if you get through 3 submissions and you haven't passed yet? What does that look like? That is a policy conversation to sort of have, and we have a couple of different examples of ways that folks have been going through it, or IHEs have been using it in different ways, because it has, sort of implications in sort of the broader, scope of the thing. But there isn't anything, right, the supports are still available, the coaching resources are still available, and so we still have students that'll, even if they don't pass, and even if they're a couple weeks late, they might be in week 8, or they might be in another, in their next semester, and they can still go back and resubmit. And there's nothing sort of time-bound in the micro-credential. What matters, again, is the portfolio. And what matters is, are they making progress towards submitting that portfolio in a way that meets that bar in the process? The first time pass rate versus the ending pass rate. So our first time pass rate is about mid-60%. And then our, after second, third time, right, we get into the 80s, 90s%, as we sort of have more scaffolding and coaching and targeted feedback. So again, it is a rigorous process. I would say, vast majority of the feedback we get from teachers is, this is not just, checking a box. That's the point, right? Teaching is not checking a box. It's actually a hard profession and a hard art form. And so we definitely sort of know that there's rigor for that. And what's also interesting is the pass rate changes based on how and when, where people are in their own micro-credential journey. So not surprisingly, our first-time pass rate on your first micro-credential is lower than the first-time pass rate on your second, third, fourth micro-credential. And so that's also sort of plays into the broader lens. What we find is people upfront, given that vulnerability factor, given the sort of the time they spend in the early, for that first micro-credential, this process feels really new, and therefore the first-time pass rates are lower, versus if you're on your second, third, fourth, fifth micro-credential, as you're going through an entire series, right, your first-time pass rate's higher because you've been going through that process. So the question is, does the applicant have any cost or expense during the process? It really just depends on the program and the partner. So obviously inside of our university partners or in our state licensure systems, sometimes the states are paying for that sort of structure and the sort of cost. There is obviously a cost to manage assessment and manage the facilitation and the coaching. That cost depends on who is paying that. So it could be the teacher in some cases, it could be so the district, it could be the state. We have all of those scenarios that play out. And then the question is, how do they want to divide that out? And who's providing what supports? And so I'll talk in a second about sort of some of the integrations where, the coaching experience here, this might be done by Bloom Board coaches and facilitators, but it might be done by district coaches and facilitators, by IHE coaches and facilitators. It really depends on sort of how y'all are building on top of the structure to navigate that process. And that's, again, part of that cost expense conversation. There's a question if we want to learn more about any impact analysis conducted on the process, impact on teacher attention, impact on student learning, impact on change in practice, where do we find this? So we have started, and it is still early, and I'll get into some of the research as we get into sort of the system quality pieces here. We have about, I think at this point, about 15 federal grants that have formal program evaluation, random control trials, studies. COVID blew up some of the student data components to that, not surprisingly. But we do have a bunch of research happening, and the early indications is, again, when we think about the research agenda for micro-credentials more broadly, we really break it into two pieces. One is, we want to know that we can actually show a meaningful change in practice in classrooms, right? Step one. Because right now, the PD research we have does not show that we can even change practice. From there, then the interesting question will be, how do we know we're changing the right practices to actually impact outcomes for kids? And so we've broken that sort of research agenda up. We've started to get some pretty interesting data. We have some, again, it's small scale and it's still sort of based on sort of, not sort of full random growth trials, but we have initial data that shows that we, in one of our district partners in Texas, right, the more micro-credentials their teachers did, right, the more they saw their MAC scores increase. And so we've started to see, sort of ways that we can sort of get some really interesting data that says that we are building mechanisms to improve practice and to change practice in classrooms, because we are frankly just asking teachers to do the work and implement practice in the classrooms. And then ultimately the goal will be is, can we then see how we can change the right practices in classrooms so that we have the ability to really change meaningful outcomes for kids. And so we're getting there, but it's still early days in the micro-credential sort of research world. And I know New America and Melissa and folks have done a bunch of work trying to help elevate some of that research, but it's just early.
Jason, thanks for answering that question. One final question from me as a follow-up. With respect to that research and that analysis, are you all disaggregating by diverse groups? Are we looking at teachers of color? Are we looking at male teachers and so forth?
So that is definitely part of a bunch of that research. So in those research studies, AIR sort of has a process. In some ways, I mean, part of what I think is most interesting about the DPI in the North Carolina context is you all frankly just have better data systems than most anyone in the country. And so one of the really interesting, exciting sort of opportunities I see is the ability in partnership here to actually get that level of data and to look at the value added, look at EVOS, look at sort of the work that you all are doing in terms of student data. We know the teacher evaluation data, the teacher observation data is spurious at best. And so that's not data I think we would necessarily want to rely on, but I think ultimately the ability to have and leverage the systems and the data architecture that you all have built and apply it against this approach is super interesting. And I get really excited about it, and we can geek out for a while on ways to sort of change and use and think about and how to respond to that data set. But to be fair, right, we're trying to do that in our federal research with AIR and with the sort of West End and other folks that we're working with. But it also depends on what those grants are focused on, what they're trying to do.
Thanks, Jason. The reason I'm asking those questions, one of the things as I look at this, it reminds me to some extent of our EdTPA process. And one of the criticisms, particularly when it comes to candidates of color, is that the EdTPA process somehow might create some disparity in performance. So I was just curious as to how this process might be different from or perhaps informed by the research on the EdTPA with respect to teachers of color and so forth. So that's the nature of my question. So thank you.
Yep, and it's a really good question, and again, I think that's why we tend not to think about the micro-credentials as just the assessment, right? The moment you just think about the micro-credential process as just a pure portfolio and an assessment, you create a bunch of problems around bias and around sort of whether it's assessment and implicit bias around sort of the stuff of what you're looking for. And so that's why really when we think about the sort of the holistic experience, that coaching and that sort of cohort, sort of the coaching processes have to persist because it's where we can do really good work to sort of undo or support any bias that might exist and get better feedback in the process. And so I would say we know that bias exists. We know it exists, certainly exists in the multiple choice test practice world, right? I think it's pretty clear it exists in the IGPA world. If we can think about less about just the portfolio alone as a standalone object, but really about the sort of experience to drive and create that portfolio, it allows us a ton more flexibility to make sure we're getting the support to the people that need it so that ultimately everybody's getting to that right bar of what really strong instruction looks like. Any other questions on continuum around some of these things? This is sort of super helpful. Great questions.
Jason, this is Tom. May I ask a question?
Sure.
So I'm leveraging your spurious at best comment regarding evaluation. Any of your partner districts, are they finding any utility in these kind of standardized evidences of practice to inform the evaluation process? In other words, are we seeing any better differentiation in the principal observation and evaluation process for those folks as a result of using micro-credentials?
So we do. Again, that's why I sort of joke. In that data, we statistically significantly impacted teacher observation ratings by showing sort of improvements in observation ratings. Again, the validity, and you probably know this better than anyone in the country, right? The validity of observation ratings is not something that you can put a lot of credit towards. And so yes, we can improve teacher observation rating in procrastination because we're defining micro-credentials for that. And so I think that's where there's some calibration and assessment sort of side of those things. We have in Texas, we did get approval from TEA, from the Department of Ed in Texas, to actually let the micro-credentials stand as a replacement to their observation ratings because it is effectively a third-party assessment of practice. And that's an interesting world. We haven't gotten into the research and we haven't really gotten as enough scale into that to really validate it yet. But it does make an interesting question because in that world, it changes the model for assessment, right? It changes the model for a principal walking into a classroom where they're actually no longer the evaluator. They become the advocate of that teacher building the portfolio that gets assessed double blind by a third party that says, is this good practice or not good practice based on this criteria of rules? And that's a really interesting shift because it changes the way, and even like Joanne Weiss, when she was on board, we talked a lot about the race to the top world and the assessment, and she made a comment one word means being like, in the long run, this micro-credential structure might be the only thing that's left of race to the top in another 10 years because of the fact that it's about, objective, double-blind, third-party assessment of practice in classrooms, which in theory was part of the goal of what the teacher observation systems were meant to do. I say all this with context, like we still run Arkansas statewide. We run their observation system in a separate product. So I unfortunately know more about the pain of teacher observation and the systems around it than most, just because we've run those systems statewide and understand all of the problems with inter-rater reliability and all the problems with sort of getting good data there. But I would say, so the simple answer to your question is yes, there's definitely implications for improving teacher practice in teacher observation data, but also in potentially sort of supporting the observation process, because again, we're establishing objective criteria for a third party to do double-line assessment. Other questions? Sorry, they're doing some construction. Any other questions on micro-credential processes, systems, anything like that sort of far? Looks like we're tracking pretty well in the time there. So now we get into probably one of the areas that comes up most, which is what are the key components? What needs to exist to have a really high quality system for micro-credential sort of license, right, for a competency-based licensure, for licensure engine? And when I joke, when we think about this today, one of the things I sort of always talk about our team about is, right, in the grand scheme of things, right, the world has changed a ton in the last 10, 20 years, even alone. And so what if we could take, we live in a really bureaucratic system that has all sorts of, structures and institutions and processes that are legacies of a very different time, different place. And so what if we could take all the benefits of what we know and the perverse incentives that exist today and take all the benefits of technology and personalization, and what if we could actually use all of the benefits of that new knowledge that we have today and then start from scratch and just build a brand new, perfect licensure system. If we could build it from scratch today, what would it look like and what would it do and how would it sort of operate in the system? And so this is really sort of how we think about, when we think about changing teacher practice at scale, which is our North Star, everything we do, right? This is sort of the way that we sort of put our head around it, which is we have a ton of new knowledge and new learning. And so yes, we have to map into the legislation and the policy and the systems and the credit hours and the time components that we have, because those are just sort of the structures, the way the currency of licensure operates today. But ultimately, let's sort of try and figure out the ideal state and then figure out how we navigate that intersection. So when we think about those pieces, there's really sort of 5 key components to it, some of which we've already covered. And I think what might also be helpful is as we go through these, I want to sort of just talk about who owns which parts. And to be clear, right, some of this is not on the Bloom board or the micro-credential provider sort of side, right? But what we know is, right, we should have, in a perfect world, right, why are we using multiple choice tests to define practice? That's not something that we would do in a perfect world, right? We know that doesn't make sense for kids, it doesn't make sense for adults. And so in a new world, if we could build the ideal system, we would have a very job-embedded, classroom-embedded, portfolio-centric process that's more than just an assessment, but actually is a whole, sort of learning by doing process with scaffolds to help that is grounded in the research. And that would be, we sort of talked about that, that's the core of the system that we built. And at the end of the day, right, that system would have to then be approved by PEPSC, right, approved by the state in terms of making sure that it sort of establishes the bar for what those different pieces are. But it probably also then needs to be managed by a third party, by a micro-credential provider, because, right, that's sort of where the infrastructure and the content and all those different pieces come in. And so that's sort of the where PEPSC and the where sort of DPI sort of live in the sort of system design structure. The second pillar, and I'm going to dig deep into some of these we've already covered. So we already covered the job bed, but I'll dig into some of these, or I'll ask some questions up front if y'all have any. The second piece of that system was that it should really be stackable, so that not only, right, when we think about that career continuum, it would make sense that your high school dual enrollment intro to the profession stacks into something like a paraeducator, stacks into sort of work that can happen in your bachelor's degree, stacks into work that can happen in your master's degree, right? That idea of stackability is where workforce and where all of the systems around sort of engaging and retaining employees is going. And so it makes sense that we would have that for teachers. And frankly, because of that stackability, then it has to be integratable into the higher ed infrastructure, into advancement systems, into, right, sort of discrete licensure systems around sort of high-need areas. And at the end of the day, that's a policy construct. So I know you all have been working on different ways to think about what tiers of the licensure system would have which competencies and how it integrate. But the idea is that you have to sort of define that in policy and then ensure that whoever's running the system and the sort of the competencies can then do that integration and have sort of different ways that people sort of engage in different contexts, depending on which step of that entire curriculum you're in. The third one is really around sort of that coaching and supports architecture. And this is where things probably get the most fluid. But we do vehemently believe, right, that micro-credentials is not just about assessment, but that is about creating the means for a conversation about practice. And in many ways, we don't necessarily care who has that conversation. So that might be an adjunct at a university. It might be district and PD leadership, right, and coaches or mentors inside of districts. It might be our team of facilitators because, right, there's no capacity in the system with whatever sort of area we're focusing on. We don't necessarily care who is providing the capacity for coaching and for individual supports, but someone has to. And if you don't have a system to have to, then we have people who can do that. But ultimately, we know that coaching system has to exist because that's what's going to help manage the bias that we talk about in terms of equity and access. It's going to help manage the supports and scaffolds for moving people to this really vulnerable place about practice and about the work that they're doing. And so that's where a lot of that integration comes in. We have a ton of different examples of work that we do with all of those different sort of folks to do that integration. And then at the same time, it's got to have really rigorous, very reliable assessment. And as we talked about, right, this is not, I'll go through in a second, like, assessing portfolios at any scale is just really hard. And I would say right now, in the micro-credential world, right, vast majority of folks who are operating, right, just don't actually have that much scale on any given year where there's just not even testing the limits of assessments because frankly, there's just not enough portfolio submissions in the process. I would say we've now gotten to a place where we can do thousands of assessments in any given month, and we do every month in the process. And so the goal is we have to manage really high quality bars. We cannot water down that system, but we also have to make sure that it can scale and you can manage the infrastructure behind it. And as much as, even when we work with New York City, they want to do their own assessments, right? We have folks who are trying to build out and embed their own assessors in the process. But that's really sort of an interesting question in terms of how do you actually manage assessment at scale and how do you sort of keep the cost down? How do you sort of manage that system in a really specific way? And then the last one is really sort of time limits. And at the end of the day, right, this goes back to, right, the reason we have a 5-day turnaround time is because the moment you get to day 6, the moment you start to get some very, right, sort of anxious educators, and educators, their lives are already hard enough, right? We have to make sure that we're supporting them and trying to get them as close to real-time feedback as possible so that they can really use that. And if they didn't pass, they could change their practice. They can sort of stay, they're still in the same lesson, they're still in the same unit, right? They can sort of use that work to make sure they're getting to that far. And again, that's sort of this world, as much as we have tried to help states or help, districts or help folks build their own armies of assessors, often the capacity just does not exist in the systems that we're working in for folks to manage that. And so vast majority of the time, I think, at this point, the only examples of scale that we really have that are doing thousands of submissions, are going to be for some sort of the architecture and the network of folks doing that in the process. Sorry, the question. The framing of this implies that an IHE or district could not be an MC provider. Is that intentional? So again, I think it comes back to, right, sort of how do you want to manage and who manages the process? So I think as you think about sort of policy, as you think about sort of the ability to build micro-credentials, right, when I think about sort of the platform infrastructure, I would say, like, no, I don't think a university or a school district is going to build their own technology platform to manage assessment of thousands of portfolios, because that's just really, really hard. I'll walk through it in a second. I mean, again, it goes back to sort of the timing. So in that sense, the platform provider, the micro-credential platform provider does have to be a pretty discrete skill, in the same way we wouldn't ask school districts and universities to sort of build their own LMSs, right? Like the technology infrastructure of learning, right, is different than the process of learning. And so that's why we have sort of built-in mechanisms to do integration with districts and providers, but that there is a tech component, because anything that you're going to do is going to have scale behind it if you're operating at the scale that you all at the PEPSC level are operating. And so that scale is immediately going to break under any non-tech enabled structure. And we've seen it break many times over, and we're often the ones that get called to fix it when it breaks. And so I would say that's really when we think about the tech platform side of micro-credential providers, right? That's really the necessary mechanism. Does that make sense?
This is Van, I asked that question. The explanation makes sense. I'm not sure I agree with it. Matter of fact, I'm pretty confident I don't. But I just wanted to make that clear. I just wanted to be clear on that is an assumption, that the model is that there would be a group of providers outside of school districts, institutions of higher education, the Department of Public Instruction. Who would be among these providers?
So I think that's the approval process that I mentioned in terms of like that's why this doesn't say Blue Board provider this is PEPSC would need to approve who meets the bar of rigor for providing the platform services to navigate the system. And that, sure, so there might be, in the world of like, I'm trying to think about sort of universities. So like MIT spun out there, right, edX, right, sort of came from their system, and that is technology that MIT built to build, right, some of that same course infrastructure in a sort of more competency way. But at the same time, like that's still that's a separate tech platform, right, sort of set of infrastructure that then would still need to be approved by PEPSC as an approved provider in the way that you've already, right, approved at TPA in that process. And so there could be multiple micro-credential providers. But I think the question is, how do you sort of, it would be hard for any given district to manage their own technology infrastructure in a way that could deal with the scale that we're actually seeing, right, and the feedback time and the rigor and the inter-rate reliability that we would need to actually do this really well.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. As a member of PEPSC and a co-chair of one of the subcommittees, I'm not willing to go to that assumption yet that you just made. I think there are, depending on what this looks like and what needs to be managed, I think there are entities within the state that could do that could be based in a district or an IHE or a partnership among them, multi-district, multi-IHE partnership or partnership with DPI. I don't want to leave this meeting with at least the subcommittee that I co-chair assuming that assumption is necessarily the case.
Yep. And again, we're happy to sort of dig into that assumption more. Again, that assumption is built on this question of how do you manage at scale, right? If you had to do, if based on the systems that exist, right, what would it look like to have tens of thousands of a set of submissions come in inside of a month? And how would sort of whatever provider or system manage that, right? That is a capacity constraint that is very hard to meet the needs based on what we've seen in any example. Like there are no examples today of anyone at that level. I would say I know definitively we have the most scale of anyone that exists in the micro-credential side on that front from a portfolio assessment standpoint. But that is a good assumption to test, and I'd be happy to sort of talk through more detail about what assumptions you're trying to look at in terms of numbers and submissions and turnaround times and asset quality. But again, it also means like some of these things we can build into local systems. So in many cases in Kentucky, our assessment sort of infrastructure is actually built from Kentucky assessors. So we can build and recruit from North Carolina teachers in North Carolina sort of institutions and build out the army of assessors, but somebody still would need to manage the sort of certification process and the calibration and the control and the inter-rate reliability. And that is where the technology component comes in the same way, right? Those technology tools have to have a level of scale and rigor behind them that make them often hard for a district to build themselves, because it is a technology application problem. But happy to dig into that in more detail if that's helpful to inform the subcommittees in the process in terms of just what those assumptions are. And so maybe it'd be helpful just to sort of talk through it, and we can sort of dig into these, and that way we can really just open it up for Q&A. Obviously, we've talked through the platform side of the learning experience and trying to think about broadening that from just pure assessment and pure portfolio into sort of a more holistic, right, sort of job-embedded structure. We've talked a bunch about sort of the stackability side of this and that integration with IAT partners, with, right, sort of providing almost sort of the LMS componentry behind, sort of this different model and what that looks like in terms of that process and sort of how your policy environment builds, right, on-ramps and off-ramps for educators into the career systems. On the coaching side, I would use this, and this is probably sort of one of these integration points that comes up quite a bit in some of the process. When we think about coaching in cohorts, often what we're trying to sort of architect or at least sort of build out so that there are different approaches is really a much more personalized approach to support. And so we right now run, because we know we have first-time candidates, first-time people in my credentials that don't have a lot of experience, we run what we call these Blue Board Academies. And the idea, it's almost sort of like a boot camp for really it's just your first micro-credential. But the idea in that first micro-credential is that you have a ton of scaffolding. There's simulations that you can do to start to get your feet wet in the process. There's a coach that you get intro to. There's a whole set of protocols around that structure. But ultimately, that academy is meant to just help you learn how this competency-based sort of process happens. In the same way, right, learning to read is hard, but then you can read to learn, and that becomes a much more efficient process. And so what happens from there, and what we've really started pushing for in, right, different IAT partners, different district partners, to say, well, the moment you can do that, COVID has taught us, probably more than anything, that, right, we can start to move the center of implementation all the way to the individual teacher. And unfortunately, for teachers, for vast majority of teachers for a vast majority of time, PD and learning and licensure has been done to teachers on pretty much everyone else's terms other than their own. And that's part of the problem that we find in terms of the broader profession, in terms of the recruitment and advancement, and just attracting teachers to the profession, is it sort of feels like a very sort of, subjected to, right, population in terms of a lot of these sort of policies. And what we're saying is, all of a sudden now, we actually have, for all of the teachers, for the tens of thousands of educators in the system, right, we have one-on-one conversations with every single one of them every semester. And that conversation is built around, well, tell me what's going on in your life. And as you think about, right, how you want to sort of engage in your own advancement learning, maybe you like going through these, PLC-like, or sort of regular meetings that are coming up over the semester around specific content areas, around sort of, where you have a cohort, and you like interacting with your peers. Some teachers don't like their peers, and they really just want to buddy up with a person down the hall or go alone and say, look, I want to make a ton of progress. I've got a ton of stuff going on in my family life. I can't do bus time. I can't do after school work, and so I want to be able to sort of just make a ton of progress. And then I want to set up a one-on-one conversation with a coach and a facilitator, or, somebody give me feedback on my portfolio so that I can then go through the process. And then we have some small set of people who are just totally self-service. I don't know how they do it, but they do it. And they can work through a ton of my credentials relatively quickly, totally on their own, without that support scaffold. But ultimately, the idea is that we know that educators need scaffolds and support, and so it's about how these sets of tools then create the infrastructure or can embed in the infrastructure that, whether it's an IAT, whether it's a district, whether it's some sort of organization can use. And so this is where a lot of the heavy lifting can be done in the micro-credential support world, but that opportunity and the structures have to exist to create these engagement points. Because if it's just about the portfolio, what we know is people will get frustrated and then they don't resubmit and they don't go through the process and then they actually don't complete and they just churn. And so that's really what we've done in terms of trying to create a much more personalized system in place for that. Any questions on the support side? Okay. And then obviously now, and we've talked a little bit about this, so far, when we think about rigor and reliability of assessment, this is one of these areas that just becomes really hard. And so, rigorous and timely assessment is really hard to do. And I can tell you, the problem on the technology side is, right, we always, even when we were doing this with, sort of different folks, and Friday Institute and other folks, like what we know is that any day that passes, and we said it a couple times, right? Teachers get more and more frustrated by the fact that they haven't gotten their feedback. And there is no way to manage it without deadlines, and so you're always going to aggregate submissions. And generally, if you're working at any sort of scale, even at a local district level, we'll get several hundred or 1,000 submissions in the same set in a couple days. And that's just the norm. And so the reality is there has to be a set of infrastructure that can manage thousands, right? And in the DPI case, tens of thousands of submissions inside of weeks, not months, because they're going to come in a very lumpy way. And so the way that we've started to think about and manage that process is to say, okay, for every assessor, every sort of assessment in the system, we have to have 5 years of teaching, 2 years of coaching and mentoring. Ideally, you have national board certification, and you've gone through a certification process on its own, in our case, a micro-credential, that allows you to make sure that you can provide very targeted feedback in very specific ways against a master scored set of micro-credentials to make sure that you are calibrated appropriately to both rate appropriately and understand sort of some of the differentiation that we talked about in terms of managing that process. And so, thinking about sort of how many assessments you need and how to manage that, and obviously the assessor army is something we can certainly build from within North Carolina that creates another opportunity for teachers to sort of earn more income in the process. But ultimately, there's got to be a set of rigor and certification process around that, and a way to sort of calibrate and make sure that sort of process happens. From there, once you have really strong assessors and you have a whole army of them, right, then it's really about the process for managing assessments and managing and sort of continuously monitoring all of the checkpoints in that process. And so the way we go through that, so every micro-credential, I don't know if we didn't really cover this early on, but every micro-credential is double blind. So the assessors don't know. We de-PII, we take out all the PII from any of the actual submission artifacts. And so we sort of anonymize that structure so that there shouldn't be affiliation between assessors and educators. And then there's 2 assessors that review every single micro-credential, and then we manage 80%, so we track the inter-rater reliability of that, and we manage that very, very closely. And according to the research statistics on inter-rater reliability, which I'm sure Dr. Tomlin would happily talk to you about inter-rater reliability, we manage that at 80%, which is almost perfect according to statistical significance there. And then that sort of allows us to have a really clear sort of quality control. And so we know if assessors start to actually rate better or worse than what they should be, we see that. And we see that weekly as we're sort of managing and calibrating that system. And we're doing it, again, on the order of thousands of micro-credentials per month, because that's sort of what we have to do. And it's also sort of the rigor that most standards boards and licensure sort of folks are relying on us to navigate and manage very clearly and very specifically. And then the last piece that is, a little still moving is, as we get going here, right, there is a lot of machine learning and a lot of artificial intelligence and sort of tools that we can build for assessors that help make that process easier to navigate and manage. And so at some point, there may be a world where we can have, sort of districts doing their own assessment. Again, you still run into inter-rater reliability and sort of bias issues, but there may be a world where we can actually drive the time of assessment down by giving actual scores. I don't think we're nowhere close to ever having just an automated scoring process for portfolios. That's a long way away, certainly on the sort of order of decade plus. But at the moment, we know that there are tools that AI can use, that we can use, that we're already building into the assessment system that can make it faster for human assessors to review those portfolios and get feedback and sort of make sure that they're standardizing and make sure that they're calibrating in a really strong and rigorous way. And so we've been building that entire infrastructure out. But at the end of the day, this assessment process is just technology, It is the reason why, we wouldn't expect people to build their own email tools, their own LMSs, We have technology companies build, infrastructure, because infrastructure is really hard to do at any sort of scale, and that's where sort of technology companies can sort of manage that process in really specific ways. Any questions on assessment and sort of the timeliness? Because timeliness really falls in that same thing, which is, the reason we sort of go through that. But any questions on assessment for rigor and qualifications here? And so the last piece is, again, is that timeliness. And so as you can imagine, the closer you are to, right, we know that frustration that educators experience, right, is really high. And if you create frustration around a really vulnerable process, you will just have people leave. And they will opt out and they will get very frustrated, and that sort of will create and exacerbate the talent pipeline problems that we're already having. And so being able to, right, like I said, we have a 5 days, so we manage this entire system for 99.7 or 99.8% of the micro-credential submissions we get across the tens of thousands that we do, we guarantee a 5-day turnaround time. And that 5-day turnaround time is built on this fundamental sort of reality that we have to get as close to the instructional practice as possible, because that's what teachers need, and that's what's only going to sort of help increase the reliability of the data and the actual sort of teacher engagement in the process. Because every day that happens, I mean, again, put yourself in a really vulnerable situation where you recorded yourself on video and it felt a little, awkward to do so, and you took your lesson plan, your student work, and then you uploaded it, and then you didn't hear back for a week. And then you didn't hear back for 2 weeks, or for 3 weeks, or for 4 weeks, which is what we always saw in the early days. And you're just, all of a sudden now, you get a really frustrated, educator who doesn't then want to even resubmit because they're so far away from the lesson in the unit that they can't make the connections back to the feedback that came from the actual assessment. And so it builds frustration. So the timeliness is one of those pieces here that we just tend to push on a lot, and that has to be, again, an approved bar, but we're constantly trying to get down to sort of as short a time frame as possible as we can, because we know that time frame and the sort of feedback mechanism there is about as important from an undermining the ecosystem standpoint as you can get. And that's sort of it. And so we've got 23 minutes for Q&A. I don't know if there are other questions or other pieces, anything that other folks have that we want to sort of make sure we talk through. This is really sort of everything I have to share so far.
Hey, Jason, this is Brian Hassel here in Chapel Hill. Can you say something about the cost of the assessment process? I'm not sure the right grain size of that, but if you think about a teacher going through a licensure process, what are we talking about when we talk about this rigorous assessment by pretty highly qualified people who presumably are earning a fair bit for their work?
Yep. So the cost of an individual micro-credential assessment, so in our world, right, it comes down to sort of for any given micro-credential, so to go through that entire process. And again, that cost depends on the sort of structure. What we find is that in general, most folks, districts, IHEs, right, we've seen are able to sort of manage the facilitation and the assessment all in for, less than $300 per micro-credential in the process. Obviously, it depends on sort of how that works. I would say it'd be hard to break out. I'm sure we could break out in more detail depending on the structure. But if we said that entire process of, stipends for mentors and facilitators, stipends for the assessors, right, or sort of cost per micro-credential submission for the assessors, all of that plus the technology can be done for, $250 per micro-credential, less than $300 per micro-credential process. And then again, that depends on who's taking on which of those, sort of pieces in terms of that division of labor of who's doing facilitation, who's doing assessment, and who's sort of building out that structure. Other questions? Thoughts, comments, concerns? Does the state fund the cost of the district or the individual? So the question is, does the state fund the cost or the district or the individual teacher? Right now we have all three. So we have states that fund certain parts of it. We have districts that fund certain parts of it, and we have individual teachers that fund certain parts of it. So that is really ultimately a question for, I think, sort of PEPSC, sort of DPI infrastructure to figure out how would you want to structure that, and what would that cost look like in terms of the funding systems that you all have in place to navigate that structure. But we can certainly accommodate all three. And it obviously depends on some parts and sort of where you are in the advancement system in that entire ecosystem. This is probably the question for Tom. In the system these subcommittees are designing, where would the micro-credentials likely be used? That is a great question for Tom.
So there's a couple of places where all this work would manifest itself. So first, the preparation and entry. So the question of when we talk about a traditional completer and how they would be positioned as they come out of that program, how would they be positioned on the salary schedule, or in what level of license would they enter? So that could be this could be one of the so a micro-credential set of micro-credentials could be one of the evidences they use to position them on a license 3 as opposed to a license 1, let's say. And just to clarify, we are developing other measures that could be used to determine that position on the salary scale, but this could be one of those of micro-credential settings. And then in licensure, so whether or not we use micro-credentials as an evidence of meeting a standard for a license, that is under the purview of the licensure subcommittee. So really that would probably be the first place that this would have to be sorted out is, are we going to use micro-credentials for the purposes of establishing meeting the requirements to hold a certain level of the license? And if that answer is yes, then of course it would go back, then prep and entry would know that is a tool that they could leverage for positioning folks on entry. And then of course the advancement and development, how do you move from where you're placed originally to the next one? So they would need to look at it, and if we're going to assume that micro-credentials are one of these measures, then they would say, okay, it's this configuration that moves you from 2 to 3. That in order to move from 2 to 3, you have to do X, Y, and Z. So that's the three places. Budget and compensation, it really doesn't have much of an impact on, unless we started formally recognizing that we needed some kind of, if we needed to incorporate this process at the state level, then that would certainly be a budget implication for moving this work forward. Does that help, Brian? I think it was Brian who asked the question. Yes.
Yes, thanks, Tom. That's really helpful.
So, Jason, first I want to say thank you very much. This was very informative and very helpful for understanding how you implement micro-credentials in the partners you work with across the country. I do want to say to the group, I saw a number of questions directed at Jason that were policy related, and Jason, you handled them very well. And I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seemed to me that you were answering the questions from your experience with your clients. And I'm seeing you nod your head yes here. I don't want anybody to go away from this meeting thinking we at DPI or Jason is saying this is the way it has to be in North Carolina. Policy decisions continue to be and will always be under the purview of PEPSC and the State Board of Education and the legislature. So I don't think there was no intent to suggest to anyone in here that this is the way one must do it. or that in any way that we were presenting Jason and his company as the solution to a problem. This is information for you to see how somebody is doing this kind of integration of micro-credentials into their professional learning and licensing processes. This is an example and should be construed as an example for illustrative purposes only and not for leading you down a path. With that said,
may I follow that with a comment?
sure.
As we are in a subcommittee capacity, I appreciate your clarification. And as far as my question in the chat and the subsequent discussion, that was exactly the purpose of my question. That from the point of view of the presenter, this is how it should be done. And from the language that was in the slide, that is the way it was framed. My question was simply to point out that doesn't necessarily mean that IHEs or districts or coalitions of those two things or others couldn't be MC providers. That is an open-ended question at this point.
Yes, I would agree with that. That is an open-ended question. And so
that was the point of my question.
yeah, and I hope that clarification that, I'm trying to go back to, I'm sure whatever Jason presented there as this is the way it is the way he's experiencing it. So I do want to put that caveat around any implications that this is the way it's done is purely from his perspective of working with his clients. I don't think he meant to indicate in any way that North Carolina would be required to do it this way, or that's the right way to do it.
I appreciate that. My question was from the point of view of being a subcommittee chair, representing the subcommittee and a member of PEPSC.
Absolutely. Jason, I hope I didn't say anything.
No, I think that's right. And again, that's sort of why I tried to use sort of generic terms in here, which is, right, if you have districts that again, if you have districts or IHEs that sort of can navigate the same set of infrastructure and the same problems, right, then obviously they would make sense that they could be providers in the process. I think it's still a very new system, and these are just some of the things that we've seen in the ecosystem, right, to sort of use as ways to test those assumptions and figure out at the end of the day, right, there isn't going to be sort of, a single micro-credential provider in the system, right? There will be many. If there are ones that are IHEs and districts, right, they will all have to navigate this same set of issues because these are just the issues that we've seen, right, where things really get hard and fall down. And so I feel like it's less about sort of who can be a provider, but it's however you sort of define at the PEPSC level what an approved provider is. That's really sort of the question, is sort of how do you make sure that you can sort of have those providers providing the level of support and the level of rigor that you would want in that sort of system.
Great. To Dr. Fleming's question, could the advancement accounts cover this? So from my thinking, so let's go ahead and stipulate that yes, micro-credentials are going to be used and all that stuff is worked out. It seems to me that would be an absolute yes. If the state implemented some kind of system where there was some responsibility on the part of the individual to pay for this micro-credentialing, I could certainly see a system where this is funded at the state level. But yeah, if there were costs or even cost sharing on the part of the individual applicant, it seems to me that advancement accounts would be an appropriate use of that funding for the pursuit of a micro-credential for the purposes of licensure. Another thing that's coming up and may be of interest to some of our district folks who are on here is we need to think about micro-credentials for the purposes of these subcommittees in PEPSC. we need to think about microcredentials and how they relate to state level educator licenses, which is separate and apart from any kind of competency-based professional learning that a district wants to do to support their local initiatives. Those two things can coexist in my mind, and one does not have to be subsumed by the other in order for this process to work. And this is very similar. We have always, from the state perspective, relied on the districts to direct the professional learning of their teachers for the purposes of licensure renewal, and I don't see any of that necessarily changing. There's a great need for the districts to have flexibility in what kind of professional learning they direct for their teachers to ensure that their programs and their instructional practices are supported. So I want to make sure we're keeping these two things separate as much as we can. We're exclusively talking about a system of evidences or competencies or skills that support the licensure process and not the professional learning that local districts may find important for their employees. Any other questions for Mr. Language? Thank you so much for your generosity of time and expertise on this. It really helps give me a lot of ideas. I hope it does for the other PEPSC members as well.
Appreciate it. Anything else that folks have?
All right. Well, with the consent from our 4 subcommittee co-chairs on this meeting, I would propose that we adjourn this meeting and let folks get back to their days. Dr. Graham, Dr. Fleming, Dr. Dempsey, or Dr. Weddington, any objections?
No objections for me, but I do appreciate everybody's time, and appreciate Jason being on here as well. Our district has talked to Jason quite a bit on this, and I hope it's certainly something we can look at as we move forward. I know we don't have all the answers now, but do appreciate your time.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, and just to check, Kim, this presentation is going to be available to subcommittee members if they want to just review it on their own time?
Yes, and it will be also the same presentation at 2:00.
Great.
Great.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thank you.